Welcome everyone to this GRE deep dive session.
We have quite a full schedule for this webinar. We want to start with some logistics about the GRE, also logistics for your application to the mentoring program. Then we want to show you some of the survey results for, I think most of you probably participated in the survey we did on Moodle, and use those results to give you some first advice on how to prepare for the GRE and what to expect in terms of the scores that you should be aiming for. Then 3, I'd like to go over some of the resources that are available to you, both on the web, but also through GAIN in particular. And then finally discuss some strategies, how to answer questions, and a bit of repetition to the webinar that you've had with Magoosh, go over the question types again. So that will be the first part. And then in the second part, I'm super excited that we will have 2 of our alumni, Chukwumeka and Esther. So already many thanks to them. And they will be talking a bit about their GRE experience, how they prepared for it, what were some of the challenges that they experienced. And they will also be happy to answer your questions that you had. As always, feel free to use the Q&A. We will also have some slots where you can then ask questions openly, but it's probably efficient if you start writing your questions in the Q&A. And then thanks to everybody else who's on this call for helping answer those questions. So before we dive in, I wanted to give you a little background about me, that you know who I am. So my name is Konstantin, as Gisela mentioned. I'm the co-lead together with Blas, who's also on this call, of the GAIN Mentee program management. So taking care of a lot of things that are related to you as a mentee once you participate in the second stage of the program. And I'm currently a predoctoral fellow at the University of Zurich, working with Professor Dina Pomeranz, and I'm starting my own PhD in economics in the fall this year. So I applied last year during my predoc here. I want to highlight that I'm not affiliated with ETS or any of the companies that provide study resources. So if I give recommendations, it is based on my own subjective experience. You can disagree with them. We're not getting any money for any advice that we give. Also, I may give advice that you disagree with. That's fine. I'm not an expert. I'm not a trainer. I took the GRE a few times, which I also want to highlight because it's quite common to retake the GRE and not to score as high as you want on the first time. So it's quite common and accepted to retake the GRE. And if it's of interest to you, you see my GRE score on the screen. Okay, so the first message that I want to get across is care about the GRE. So you might think it is a stupid and a small test, and you've had your master's degree or your bachelor's degree, you have a statement of purpose. All that seems maybe more relevant to economics than the GRE, which often is about high school math. But the GRE is really important for your application. And that's basically because for almost all schools that you will apply to, you will need the GRE. There are a few schools that don't require the GRE, but still the vast majority will ask for the GRE. And having a high GRE score is very important for your applications to be looked at. So the GRE is not getting you in for sure, even if you have a high score, but a low GRE score prevents you from getting in. So when universities start to screen their applications, many start looking at the GRE score and then kind of filter the high people with high GRE scores and then continue looking at your application. So you want to make sure you have a high GRE score for your application. And we will have some slides later where we show a bit what kind of score you need for certain ranges of schools. And the second, of course, is that the GRE is very important for the application to the mentoring stage. So for us at GAIN, we use the GRE as a signal of, for example, are you willing to study for a test? Are you willing to put in some time to achieve a score that we believe is in a reasonable range? So we're not going to ask you to score perfectly to get every question right, but we are going to expect that you do decent. And so you will need to invest some time. But then if you score well on the GRE, that also on these mock exams, that also increases your chances to get into the GRE, to get into the GAIN mentoring program. So care about the GRE. Don't take it lightly, please. The second point I want to get across from the beginning is use the GRE to your advantage. So unfortunately, many of you will not have had the opportunity to go to a school in the global north. Maybe some people, so in the US, for example, or even for me in Europe, I had the privilege to go to a school here that many people know. That will not be the case for everybody of you. And so for the admissions committees, sometimes it's hard to evaluate degrees from different universities they are less familiar with, but they know the GRE. And so if you score high on the GRE, that they know what that means. So through the GRE, you can signal your abilities because the GRE, it's the same for everybody. So I'm taking the same GRE as you're going to take. And so if you score high, that will maybe not guarantee, but that will really help your application to be looked at and considered carefully. So use it to your advantage and try to study as much as you can. Which brings me to the third message I want to get across in the beginning, which is don't underestimate the GRE. When you do the questions in itself, they all look relatively easy. It is high school math that you've probably done in your 9th grade or 10th grade. What's the total degrees in a triangle? That's stuff that you know, and that's not why the GRE is difficult. The GRE gets difficult because you have to answer a certain number of questions in a relatively short time. And so once you get stuck on one question, you may have no time in the end, and then all of a sudden you get stressed and you make mistakes that under normal circumstances you would not do. So there are certain challenges, even like they try to trick you in certain cases that make the GRE difficult as a whole. So don't underestimate it. Don't just do a few questions and think you've got this. Really try to study hard, follow the advice that we're going to give you in the next few minutes, and take it seriously. Also, I should note that most of the questions that we will be going through today, they're relatively easy for the sake of getting you familiar with the questions. There are more difficult questions in the GRE than we will gonna go through today. All right, so getting to the real first point, which is about the logistics. As I already mentioned, the GRE is critical to your application to the GAIN mentoring program. And so there are two ways that you can submit a GRE score, either mock exams via the Magoosh platform or scores from an actual GRE test. Meaning if you already took the GRE, you don't have to do the mock exams anymore. If you decide to take the mock exams that we partner with Magoosh for, then what we're asking for is the quant scores from 2 mock exams and the verbal score from 1 mock exam. So if you take the first mock exam and you're already happy with your verbal score, you can kind of skip over the verbal in the second one that you take it. But we want the quant score from 2 mock exams. Also, if you took the actual GRE, but you have a quant score of less than about 145, 154, then we recommend that you take the mock exam with Magoosh instead of submitting your actual score, so as to increase the chances of being admitted. And you should have received an email that allows you to sign up for one of 2 slots for the Magoosh window. So that is either starting today, I believe, May 3rd for the next 14 days, or starting in a week again for 2 weeks. So that will give you access to Magoosh for a 2-week window where you can then take the mock exams. Some of you will get into the mentoring, some may not. So some practical considerations already for when you take the actual GRE. So it depends a bit where you're from and where you currently live, how close the test center is. And so some of you will have to travel to the test center. And when you do that, try to travel a day in advance so that on the test day itself, you can be calm. And if you get stuck in traffic on a long distance journey, that doesn't like increase your nervousness or so. So you want on the test day itself, you want to be very calm. So if you have to travel, try to travel the day before already. Since COVID, you have the opportunity to take the GRE at home. That might be convenient for people who have to travel far. And if you have to travel very far and if it's very costly, then it might make sense to take it at home. But we also want to stress that past mentees had issues taking the test at home. which often correlates to things like you have to have a stable internet connection. You have to have a room where you can actually be alone without anybody walking into while you take the test. You need to have a certain type of board where you need to write your questions on. So if you want to take it at home, make sure you carefully check the requirements on the ETS website, whether taking it at home is feasible for you or not. Otherwise, the test center option tends to be the safer one. Also, it is very important to register with your exact name, which matches on the official identification required for the GRE. So in some countries, you need your national ID. For some countries, the driver's license, sometimes the passport. All that information is available online, but you really want to make sure that it's the exact name and not like the name you go by with, because if there's a small difference, then you will not be able to take the test and you're not going to get a refund of your money. Also, try to book the GRE early in advance, but take into account that rescheduling is costly. So you want to be relatively sure that you're able to take the test, but don't wait for 2 weeks before, especially as you get towards October, November. It might be that the test slots that are available are already occupied by other people. And then what I said before, it is common to retake the GRE. So if you take the GRE first and you're not happy with your score, that is fine and that is okay. Many people take it a second time, maybe even a third time. Now, there is a cost involved for doing so, but also most people that then study again improve on the second time. And so don't be discouraged if your first GRE is not as you had hoped for. When you send the scores to the universities, you can select the score which one you want to send. So the universities itself, they don't see how often you took the GRE. But so already keep in mind that maybe retaking is common. So your first effort should be like the first time you take the real GRE should be early enough so that you still have time to retake it if needed. If my application is due December 1st, I don't want to take the GRE on November 15 because then I don't have time to take it a second time. If I take it in July or August for the first time, I can take it again in October or November. So it still gives me some time to take it again. Also, the final point, if you will study hard for the GRE, but then on the final day, there will be some noise in the test score. So it's very hard to say for sure you will do 163. On the test day, you may be lucky with the type of questions, or you may be less lucky. You may have a very good day or the opposite. But the region of your score is not random. So if you don't study well, you will not go into the 165 region or in the 160 region. But if you study hard, you can predict to have a certain score in a certain region. So don't just think it's all random, but if you get 100, let's say 170 or not, that may be a bit random towards the end. So don't be discouraged again. If one of your friends has 2 points more than you, that might have been just luck on the test day. All right, so then moving on to the survey results and some first advice. And thanks for everybody who filled out the survey, which makes this now possible. And so the first question that we were asking is, have you taken the GRE before? And we have among those people that I think 186 or so that replied, 47 already have taken the GRE, whereas 140 of you are yet to take the GRE for the first time. And then I think kind of mirroring that pattern, the question, have you already started studying for the GRE? We have 43 who said no, which are probably the ones that have taken it already. And then we had 143 who said they have started already. So that is great because the mentoring stage application is open and the slots for the Mekush are now. So it's great to see that 143 people are studying already. We also ask on how many days per week are you studying if you have started studying already. And what we see is that we have a few people who study on one day a week, and we have a bit more that study 6 to 7 days a week, but the majority studies for about 2 to 5, with the median respondent studying 4 days of the week. We also ask you on the day that you're studying, for how many hours are you studying? And again, here we have a bit of a spread. We have one person who spends 12 hours studying, according to the survey. So congratulations. It seems like a lot of time. I think maybe a bit more realistically, we have a bunch of people who study for 2 to 3 hours or for 4 to 5 hours, with the average student among you studying for 3.5 hours. So that leads me to the question, how much should I study? And the first point that I want to emphasize here is there is no one-size-fits-it-all study plan. So what works for me may not work for someone else. I may not be studying currently, so maybe I have a lot of time to study, whereas someone else might be in a job or writing the master's thesis, so a bit more time constrained. So in the end, you have to figure out what works for you and how much you want to allocate on a specific day and over time. But what I would say is that you should study for at least 2 months try to study about 1 to 2 hours per weekday and maybe 3 to 5 hours on the weekend. So on one of the weekend days, try to do a longer study time and then maybe take 1 day off. But during the week, try to consistently study for 1 to 2 hours. And I'm stressing consistent because in my experience, if you study consistently, that helps you improve more. But some of my friends, what they do is they study for 3 weeks, but then they study full time. But that is you're only able to do that if you don't have anything else going on. So a short time means studying more per day. And I think in line with this, on GRAGMAT, you can find study plans for either 1 month or 2 months, where again, the 1 month is it's more compressed and you need to invest more time per day rather than if you spread it over 2 months. So that's in terms of how much time you should allocate. And then how should you go about your studies? The first point that we recommend from the GAIN side, or partly me personally, is try to get familiar with what's in the test. So very basic, what are the concepts they're asking for? I'm sure most of you by now have done that already, but if not, on the slides that we're sharing, there will be a link to the content of the test. And just make yourself roughly familiar. You don't have to be an expert at this point, but just try to understand, okay, there are some data interpretation questions. There's going to be some geometry in there. There's going to be some arithmetics. There will be a verbal section you have to write at some point. So get a rough sense of what's in the GRE. And then second, you want to understand how good are you already? Where do you stand? So try to take a free online mock exam to identify your approximate baseline level. So most of the companies, may it be Kaplan, Princeton Review, Manhattan, ETS, they all have free online tests that you can take. And in the beginning, take 1 or 2 of them so that you already get a feeling of what's the GRE like and where are you even without studying. And that also helps you to improve a bit, or maybe identify what are the strengths and weaknesses, what are the concepts that you haven't seen in a long time. But at least you get a full picture of the GRE. And then before you stress about timing and strategies, try to just become more familiar and fluent with the type of the questions. So do a bunch of practice questions before then moving on to the next phase. And there are 2 sources that I like for just questions in itself. So one's ETS, the company that administers the test itself, they have a math review, and there is a practice book, which is called the Manhattan 5-pound book, which is just a ton of questions you can do. So once you are familiar with the type of questions, study under both timed conditions and untimed conditions. So as you study under timed conditions, that is very important to just have a general study session where you try to give yourself 1 to 2 minutes per question. And also try to do these question sets. So in the GRE, you will get, in the math part, you will get 20 questions and you have 35 minutes for it. So try to do this block of questions where you answer 20 questions in 35 minutes. And then, of course, you can do those sets individually, and you can take a full GRE test. And so when you take the full GRE test, that takes a bit of time because you have several sections, so you might want to do that on the weekend. But also, it is important to do some untimed sessions where you care less about being fast, but more about how you solve questions. And here, and I personally really hate that, so I had to force myself to do that, is try to solve the same question using different strategies. So when I first took the GRE, I just went ahead, solved it the way I knew, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. But there are always several ways how to get to the answer. And different ways might be quicker in certain scenarios. Plus, if you get stuck on a question, knowing another approach how to solve the same question can help you overcome being stuck on the question. So in my final GRE that I took, that really helped me to be able to draw on a different strategy when I didn't know how to approach the question with maybe the concepts that I've been more familiar with before starting to study for the GRE. So try to study both timed and under untimed conditions. And finally, regardless of the type of resources you use or how much you want to use a study, practice, practice, practice. So the GRE, it just comes with experience and practicing, and you want to do as many questions as possible. You want to know them inside out until, it's really automatic for you, all the types of things they ask for. And don't underestimate how much it is worth in the end to practice compared to just reading about strategy. So the strategy is important to know, but in the end, you need to be able to apply them. And that's why it's important to practice and practice and practice. Okay, in this survey, we were also asking for the quant score that you are aiming for. And we see that the kind of modal respondent was saying a score of 160. Also, quite a few people said 165, and a few people said 170. Also, a few people said 150, which I will get to on the next slide, might be a bit too low. Also, just to let you guys know, the scores are from 130 to 170. So if you have no answer correct, you will get 130. So you should really aim to be a bit more in this higher range here. Then we also ask, what's the verbal score you are aiming for? Again, a lot of people are trying to get 160, still 165 and 170, though less. But now we also have this kind of bunching here at 155. Again, a few scores at 150. And also the verbal, it ranges from 130 to 170. And then we ask, lastly, what's the writing score? So the analytical writing section that you're aiming for, which this section is, I think, from 0 or 1 to 6. So it's a different scale with quite a few people aiming for a score of 4 or a score of 5. Now, what scores do I need for grad school applications? And I split it here by section because the quantitative reasoning measure is by far the most important section of the test if you're applying to economics or related fields. So if you're study constrained in terms of time, really focus on the quantitative reasoning measure. You don't get into an econ program because you have a great verbal score. But you don't get into school if you have a low quantitative score. So the quantitative measure really is the one that counts. And so to let you know, half of the people, so the median score of test takers from 2018 to 21 was 155. So 50% of people who take the test score at least 155. And many people take the GRE who will study literature in the end. So those people don't care about the quant at all. So you can imagine that maybe, I don't know these numbers, but maybe 70% of people applying to economics have a score of 155 or lower. And if you think of maybe half of people having a higher score than you, that does not make your application look very strong. However, the score that you will need depends on the school that you're applying to. And so as a rough rule of thumb, now this will be different across schools and there are exceptions to this, but kind of my personal rule of thumb is that if you want to get into a top 10 school, then you will need to be above the 90th percentile. So that means you will need to have a quant score of 168 or higher. If you're aiming for kind of a tier 2 school, which would be like 11 to 20 in the rankings, maybe, you should have above the 80th percentile, or at least the 80th percentile. So that might be 165 or higher. If you're then going to the 21 to 50, then you should at least still try to be among the best 1/3 of test takers. So try to have 160 or higher. But if we go back to the scores that you were aiming for, don't try to be in this region here. So at least try to aim for 160 or higher. And again, you may not achieve that on the first time. We're not asking for 160 for your mentoring stage application, but once you're taking the real test, really try to be 160 or higher, because then the GRE will help you. Otherwise, it will not help you. So for the verbal reasoning measure, it is substantially less important than the quant score, but you should also not be super bad. So what that means is you should try to have at least around the average or the median of 150 or 152. Now, of course, if you're higher, that's great. And many of you will be higher. But if you have the impression you're already kind of in this region, or let's say you have 153, 154 on all of your practice tests, don't study for the verbal anymore. Focus entirely on the quantitative section. If, however, on your practice tests, you get 148, 145 in the verbal, then you might want to study until the point where you get your scores over 150, 152. And it's very similar for the analytical writing measure, where again, it is not as important as the quant measure, but you want to be among the best 50% of people taking the test. So you want to have a 3.5 or a 4. But studying for the writing is also a bit easier than the verbal, because there are certain, let's say, structures that you can try to follow. Whereas for the verbal, if you really want to study, you have to study a lot of words, you have to read a lot. So it is much more difficult to improve your verbal score than your quant score, for example, in my view. Okay, so I think you got the message. Focus on the quant score as long as your verbal score is higher than the average or median. And here, just listing a few scores of some of our most successful GAIN alumni. And so you see, we have alumni scoring 170 in the quant, 167, but also there are students who get into very good schools with a score of 158. So there are always exceptions, but then you need to be really strong in other dimensions. I think you also see that for most students here, the quant score is weakly higher than the verbal score, even though we do have also quite some high verbal scores here. But then again, someone actually has a score lower than the median and still was placed in a very strong program. But this student here had a quant score of 162. And all of them have analytical writing scores of 3.5 or higher. So I think you really want to try to kind of be in this region here if possible. But like what you also see is there is no student listed here with the quant score of 154 or so. So again, try to get into the 160 plus range. Moving on to the resources. Or are there any questions that I should answer openly, Gisela? I'm not following the chat.
Related is for the, so we support people applying for economics and also related fields. And this person is asking whether the 160 and above is also somewhat a good measure for the related fields. So political science, public policy, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. So maybe the top 10 here, you can have slightly lower scores. So it tends to be that the economics programs have the higher scores, but you should still try to be 160 or higher. Also because that makes you be more competitive compared to maybe some other people applying, for example, for political science. But many political science students also have great quantitative backgrounds, so they will also score very, very well on the GRE. But these criteria here, in my limited experience, are for economics programs. So you don't have to stress too much about the 90th percentile maybe, but try to kind of have 165-ish, even if you want to go for a top tier political science school. And to be frank, that the few people I know who went into really top 10 political science, they still had a perfect score in the GRE. So they had 170 in the GRE. I'm not saying that is what you have to have, but it helps your application. So try to be as high as possible. And then in the end, you apply with the score you have. But try to aim high and study for high scores.
Okay, thank you. And another question is on a calculator. Are calculators allowed?
Yeah, so you're not allowed to bring anything into the GRE, but they have a calculator embedded on the screen. So somewhere like here, you would have a little symbol for the calculator. Then you can click on it, and then you can type. You can actually use the keyboard as well to use that calculator. I'll come back to calculators in the strategy section. So there will be a point whether to use them or not.
Yeah, perfect. No more questions.
Cool, thanks. So then moving on to the resources, what you can do to study. And so first, independent of GAIN, there are lots of resources online. And we compiled a list from GAIN here. And you can really go far by searching the web. Now, personal recommendations, just for pure practicing, so not really the strategy type, but more the practicing, is this Manhattan book, which is like when it used to be printed, it used to be this thick, and it's just questions over questions. A bit of strategy also is included in this ETS, Official Quantitative Reasoning Practice Questions book. What I like about it is that it is from the test makers itself. So those questions are probably the best tailored to the actual GRE. But it is shorter, so you will need to complement this book here with something else. And so during the current phase, you all have this 2-month subscription for GRACMed. And GRACMed really is amazing for strategy. It's also good for practicing, maybe not as good as others, but for strategy, it is incredible. And so there are a bunch of videos that you can watch for getting the right strategy and how to approach the test. And then you also have this 2 weeks window for Magoosh, which is a great tool in my view for practicing, as it kind of mirrors the interface of the real GRE. It's very adaptive. It has very good answers, both written and videos to the questions. So also by watching the answers, you can get a bit of the hang of the strategies. If you make it to the mentoring phase, which I hope you do, we provide a 6-month subscription for Magoosh, so then you can really exploit that tool for your GRE studies. But what I do want to emphasize is, regardless of whether you make it to the GRE or not, to the GAIN mentoring phase, there are a bunch of resources online, and many of which you can get without cost. So if you make it to the mentoring phase or not, you will be able to study at a relatively reasonable cost for the GRE. Okay, so let's get started on strategies. And so the first strategy I want to emphasize is more about a point that is important, namely pacing is key. So how fast you answer the questions. And so a quantitative block, so I should say that this year is for the quant, is 35 minutes and 20 questions. So I think per question that is somewhere in between 1 and 2 minutes. And that already shows you don't have that much time for a single question. Also, if you spend, let's say, 5 minutes on one question, then all of a sudden you're left with 30 minutes for 19 questions. So you want to make sure not to spend a lot of time on an individual question, especially in the beginning. And as you practice, then you will become quicker over time. I saw a hand was raised, but that was probably unintentional. But let me know if not, or just raise your hand again. Okay, so now a bit more specifically about strategies. The first thing that I kind of mentioned already is that usually there's more than one strategy to solve the same question. So you will see I might use a different approach than you would use. That's completely fine. What matters in the end is that you get to the answer. But what I mentioned before is try to be familiar with the different ways to answer the same question. So do these kind of untimed studies where you practice solving the same question, but using a different method. So maybe start answering the question with your favorite method. Then you can check, is the answer correct? And then you can explore another way to get to the same answer. And what I mentioned also before, this will help you tremendously when you get stuck on a question in the real GRE and help you not to freak out too much. Also, there are several shortcuts that you can learn, which will speed up your answers. So for example, there are these Pythagorean triplets. So I think one of them, for me, it's been too long, but it's kind of 3, 4, 5. So if you see two sides of a triangle, 4 and 5, you see a right angle, you already know the other one must be 3. And there are quite a bunch of them. And the GRE loves those kind of triangles where you need to find the third side or so. And it's going to be one of those Pythagorean triples. And these you can just memorize. The same for the prime numbers. I forgot most of them now, but when I took the test, I was very familiar with them. And so that also helps you because many questions ask about prime numbers. And then it's like maybe 7, 13 or so, but it's really like it takes a time in your head. But if you know them, 23, great, fantastic. So there are things, shortcuts that you can learn. And if you follow GRE or books, they will introduce those shortcuts over time. Now on the calculator, there are 2 different fields, and we happen to partner with both of them. The one side says avoid it as much as possible, which is GRE. They say avoid it because it actually takes some time to type in and open it, and you may type it wrong. So GRE is saying avoid it. Whereas if you follow Magoosh, they will use it quite frequently. And so I think you kind of have to find your right balance in this and see what questions do you want to answer using a calculator, what not. But in your studies, try to play around with both a bit, because if you improve your ability to like your mental calculations, that will help you a lot. If you can avoid easy calculations in the calculator, that again will speed it up. And so I'm a bit on the side of GRE, but there are these 2 different sides here, and I've used the calculator in the test. A very important strategy is how to skip questions. So you're within a set of quant questions, so 20 questions, 35 minutes. You can go back and forth. So you don't have to answer them in the right sequence, or if you've answered them, it's not the case that you cannot go back. You can always come back within the same set of questions. And it's important to keep in mind that each question counts the same weight. So if it's an easy question or a difficult question, it doesn't really matter. If you get them wrong, you get them wrong. If you get them right, you get them right. So since time is very precious, you don't want to get stuck on the same question. And learning when to skip or move from one question to another is very important. And then what you can do is you can just guess. So if I'm after 1 minute or even 40 seconds of the question, I realize I don't know the answer to this, then I just choose whatever, and I can mark the question as kind of like, I can mark it. And then when I'm done with all the other questions, I see an overview of all the questions and the one that I marked, and then I can go back to it. but at least I didn't waste another 4 minutes and then I had to really rush towards the end. So I'd rather get one wrong, but still have enough time for all the other ones than spending too much time on one question and maybe still getting it wrong because I didn't have a good strategy for it. Okay, so now on some answer strategies. So the first strategy, which ETS advises, is to translate words to an arithmetic or algebraic representation. So for example, they might have a sentence like the cost of a bus ride is $5 plus an additional 25 cents per each kilometer to the destination. And that's going to be very easy for you guys, of course, but you can just write this mathematically as saying, okay, I have my total cost, which is $5 plus 25 cents for each kilometer. But where now X, of course, means kilometer. But so you have to be able to kind of go back and forth between text and equations, and sometimes help, like putting things into the equation helps translate and actually understand what's the mathematics in the sentence here. The other is that you will have text that you might want to translate into a figure or a diagram. So one other question might be, which number is the farthest from the number 1 on the number line? And here it's a bit obvious, it already says number line. So, but what you can do is you can just draw a number line and you can draw the number 1, you might have the number 0, you have 10 on the one side and minus 10 on the other. And that makes it relatively quick to see, okay, how far is 1 from 10 and how far is minus 10 from 1? Now, these examples might be a bit too simplistic, but drawing these kinds of things can help you to see very, very quickly that minus 10 is further away than 10 from 1. Okay, so now I want you to try to solve this question, and you will have a minute, and we have a poll, and then I can discuss how I would approach that. And I think the poll should show up now. Great. Don't put the answer in the chat, please. So I'm not saying whether it's correct, but don't put answers in the chat, only answer to the poll. Also, we're not recording who says what, so this is completely just for the fun of it. Sorry, thanks. I was muted. So thanks for writing that in the chat. So then you didn't hear that I was counting down, but anyway, you have more opportunities to answer. So not half, but the majority said E. Quite a few people said C as well, and then we have some with the remaining answers as well. And so to talk a bit about the strategy here, and please don't write answers in the chat. Only write them in when we do the survey. But so the strategy is about translating from an algebraic to a graphical representation. So what you clearly see is we have a graph here, and we have some algebraic information here. And so the idea kind of is to translate what's written, for example, in A into the graph. And so let's maybe focus on A, which is the graph of x minus 2. And so I'm sure this is very simple for you guys, but so we're starting with minus 2. So if x was 0, then, okay, we're starting here. And then it's just a straight line. So at 2, we would be at 0. So we can kind of draw this nice little line through here, and we see, okay, it's not intersecting the graph at all. So that's, maybe I should have said this first. This is what this is asking for, intersect the graph. Okay, so we already know it's not A. And you can kind of do this if you wanted to with all the different answers, but what you would end up, and most of you had it right, is that E is the correct answer. So here, again, you're starting at minus 3, but now you're actually going much steeper, and so eventually it will cross the curve here. And this is now not drawn to the right extent. This question here, you could have actually also seen, you could have looked at the slopes, but this strategy now kind of is to add to the graph here. So try to add to graphical representation if possible. Now I should add that in the GRE, you don't actually have that printed out, but you can always sketch on your sheet of paper. Okay, so the next question is now translate from a figure, or in this case, so the GRE calls this a figure, but it's more like a table, to an arithmetic or algebraic representation. And again, you will have about a minute to answer the questions here. So please don't write answers in the chat. Only type the answer in this little thing that popped up. If nothing popped up, then please just write it down on your sheet of paper. That's good enough. Okay, 10 more seconds. And stop. Okay, so now I cannot actually see the results, I believe. Maybe you guys can. Okay, we'll follow up with the results later because I didn't see the results myself. But anyway, so this question here says, so first maybe what you see here is you see the results of a used car auction, and it provides you information on the numbers of cars offers, the number of cars that were sold, how much they projected sales, and the actual sales. And also importantly here, they're giving some units. So they're writing in thousands. So that is important to keep the unit into account here. And then what the question is asking for is, so for the large cars sold, and also, so you have two hints already, large and sold, summarized in the table above, what was the average sale price per car? So you already know that you want to look at the large cars and you want to look at those sold. So the whole idea about projected, that's not really important. You want to care about the actual sales and the number of cars that were sold. And so then, as I think some people wrote successfully in the chat, the answer would be 120,000. So the actual sales over how many cars did you sell? So 20. And that, of course, then is 6,000, which you would write into the little box here. And I should add that I might make a mistake, so you should always pay attention and try to correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so the next strategy is to simplify an arithmetic or algebraic representation. And again, you get 30 seconds to read through your question here and try to answer while I show up the poll here. Do 10 more seconds. Right, and stop. Okay, so here it seems really undecided. We have almost as many people say that B is greater, and we have people saying the quantities are equal, and then a few people saying A and B. So this question here is one that is very common. So it is a quantitative comparison where you're giving some information, and then you have a quantity A and a quantity B. And you're supposed to say which one is larger, if any, and if you can tell. So these answers here, A to D, they will always be the same. So you should know this by heart, that A means quantity A is larger, B, quantity B is larger, C, the quantities are the same, and D, we don't really know. It cannot be determined with the information given here. But let's think about strategy here for a second. So what do they mean by simplify? So what you are given is that 3 times y plus 2, all that over 5, is it bigger or larger than y? Now, that looks maybe a bit complicated, so you can try to rearrange this a bit and simplify. So for example, you can multiply this whole thing with 5. What you would then get is the question 3 plus 2, is it larger or smaller than 5 times y? And keep in mind that what we've done now is we've multiplied by 5. So that is not a negative number, which is important. That's not 0. Because if you would multiply by a negative number or 0, that would change the relationships. But as long as you're multiplying with a positive number, or you just add or subtract something, the relationships here, so this little question mark here, that doesn't change. But now this still looks maybe a bit too complicated. So what we can also do is we can take these 3 y's on the left to the right side, and we will be left with 2. Is it larger or smaller than 2y? Now that we can further simplify to 1 question y. And now that's cool because what we have here, we can compare directly to the information given. So we know that y will be greater than 4. So then y must also be larger than 1, because maybe it's 4.1, maybe it's 10, we don't know, but for sure it's larger than 4, and 4 is larger than 1. So we simplified this expression here to 1 smaller or equal or greater than y. And so clearly now the correct answer here would be B. Okay, the next question we've already answered, but it's kind of related to this translating from one to another, which is to add to a geometric figure. And so here the idea is, again, just you have to translate what those equations mean, and then you just draw them in here, and then you can visually see if something is intersecting or not. Another important strategy is finding a pattern. And so for the finding a pattern, it's basically to shorten an answer. So what they're asking here is, which of the following could be the unit digit of 57 to the power of n, where n is some positive integer? So the unit digit in any number, as I'm sure you know, is just the 7 here. Or if I would be writing, for example, let's say 131, the unit digit would be the 1 here. And so what they're asking is, if you take 57 to the power of a positive number, what could be the unit digit? If you start studying for the GRE, you will see those problems and you will quickly know that the 5 here is not really important. For the unit digit, the only thing that matters is the unit digit itself, the 7. So what they mean by pattern now is, let's say we have 57 to the power of 1. Now, but I was just saying, we don't need to care about the 5 here, but just 7 to the power of 1. That is relatively simple. So that's just going to be 7. Now we could also do 57 to the power of 2. So n is a positive number, so 57 to the power of 2. Again, the 5 doesn't really matter, so we don't need to consider it. So we would be doing something like 7 times 7, so that's 49. So great, now we know it's a 9. So here also, we don't really need to care about the 4, so we just keep the 9. Now we move on to 7 to the power of 3. So 9 times 7, so because 7 to the power of 3 is just 2 times 7, would be something, so 7 times 9, of course, is 63. So the unit digit of that will be 3. And now we don't have a pattern here yet, but soon you will see we will get to a pattern. If we take 7 to the power of 4, it will be something, I think now this stopped. 1 second. Okay, you can all see this again? Great. So if you take 7 to the power of 4, it will be something 3 times 7, which is something 21, where again, the 2 doesn't really matter. But now, if you do 7 to the power of 5, it's something like with a 1 at the end times 7. So it's something with a 7. And look where we started. We started with a 7, and we came back to a 7. So if you would go now and do 7 to the power of 6, you would again have something with a 9. And so you can continue doing this. Now you're stuck with the same unit digits, and you have your pattern here. So the numbers that are possible are just 7, 9, 3, and 1. And so you could go through this now and mark the ones that are possible. For example, did you ever see a 0 here? No. Did you see a 1? Yes, right here. Did you see a 2? No, and so on. So what they were asking for here is n is a positive integer. So that could go up to 1,000,000. But all you had to do here is go up to 5, and you would find that you would go back to where you started, and you found the pattern is that it's always repeating over time. Another strategy, and I need to speed up a bit so that we will have enough time with our panelists, is to search for a mathematical relationship. So to answer this question here, so it's again a quantitative comparison where we have a quantity A and a quantity B, and we need to say which one is larger. And so we will actually use 2 strategies here. First, simplify. And then second, we will be using this mathematical relationship as we are going to simplify. So if you write this, so you want to know is x to the x squared plus 1, is it larger than 2x minus 1? And the first step would be simplifying this a bit. And this takes a bit of practice to see this, but that's why studying is important. You could try to take these 2x to the left-hand side. So you would get 2x, x squared minus 2x plus 1. Is it smaller or larger than minus 1? And here is now something that is super important for the GRE. And this will be the binomial equations or formulas. Because then what you can see relatively quickly, if you're familiar with them, is that this expression here is the same as x minus 1 squared. And the question is that larger or smaller than minus 1? But of course, you know that if you take anything squared, it will always be non-negative. So x could be 0. It would be minus 1 to the power of 2, well, that is 1. If x would be 1, this would be 0, but it would still be not negative. On the right-hand side, you have a negative number. So every time the left-hand side here will be larger. And again, what we did here when we simplified, we never multiplied with a negative number. We never multiplied by 0. So the relationship itself doesn't change. So you know that this side here is larger, meaning that A is the right answer here. So try to find those mathematical relationships. Okay, another thing that the GRE really likes is to estimate. Again, a quantitative comparison, what's larger, A or B? What they're asking you is 54% of 360 larger than 150 or not. So what you can do now is you can take your calculator and type 0.54 multiplied by 360. You would get the exact number. It would be correct. But what you can also do is, okay, what's 50% of 160? Now that is much easier, and you see that is 180. And so I took less than 54%. So 54% is going to be more than 180. But 180 is already larger than 150. So clearly A must be the right answer here. So most of the time on the GRE, you can actually estimate rather than calculating exact numbers when you have these A-B comparisons. If there is a blank box and you have to put in a number, of course, it needs to be calculated correctly. You can't estimate it there. Another important strategy is trial and error. So just play around and see what works. The question here is, which two of the following numbers have a product that is between -1 and 0? Indicate both numbers. So here, the answer or the question already tells you both. So there will be two numbers you need to select. And basically, you need to multiply one number with another number. And then they have to be between -1 and 0. And what the strategy is about playing around. So multiply -20 times -10. Well, if I'm not mistaken, that would be 200. So that is, first of all, it's positive. So it cannot be between here and is way too large. So just play around with all the different combinations, and then you will get to your answer. Another strategy is to divide into cases. So here in this quantitative comparison, quantity A is supposed to be the least prime number greater than 24. And quantity B is the greatest prime number less than 28. And like I told you, I really don't like prime numbers, so I had to write this up before. But what the strategy will ask you for is divide it into two cases. Tackle A and B separately. Don't worry about B for now. Focus just on strategy, on quantity A. And so A would be a prime number greater than 24. So it must be some number 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, or so on. And what's the greatest number that is a prime number among those? You can ask, is 25 a prime number? No, it's 5 times 5. And you would find that eventually, I believe 29 is the greatest prime number. So you solved problem 1. Now the second case would be, well, type B, which is the greatest prime number less than 28. So now you can go down from 27, 26, 25, 24, but you don't actually have to do this anymore because you already found that quantity A is 29, which is larger than all the numbers that are less than 28. So you divided it into cases, but already you can jump over the second case. So in this case, the right answer would be quantity A. And this dividing into cases can help quite often when things look complicated, is to tackle things at a time. Maybe it's do an even number and then you take odd numbers and then take the combination of the two, but divide it into smaller, more manageable cases. And then another important strategy is adapt solutions to related problems. And so this problem has a big text, so it might look a bit scary, But I'll give you a minute to read through it and try to find the answer yourself. And I see some people have very quick answers, so either they did that question before or they're guessing. In 15 more seconds, which of course it's too short. In the GRE, this would be a question for almost 2 minutes probably. Right, put your answers in now. You can also guess. That would be the time for the guessing at the GRE. Okay, so relatively mixed results. I think D is the winner. B also has quite a few, but you also had this was a multiple choice where you can select multiple answers. So let's try to unpack this questions a bit. So each employee of a certain company is either in department X or in department Y. And the first important information is actually there are more than twice as many employees in department X as in department Y. So one strategy that we learned before is try to put that in mathematical terms. And so one thing you could try to do is like, okay, X is more than 2 times Y or so, the number of employees. Then you see that the average wage of the people in the department X, so the average salary is 25,000 for employees in department X. So again, you could write this kind of in a mathematical way, saying the average X is 25,000. You also get the information that the average is 35,000 for employees in department Y. 35,000 here. And now what is the question actually asking us to do? So it's asking which of the following amounts could be the average for the employees of the company. So we have a company with 2 departments, and what's the average across those 2? Now, the strategy is about related problems. And so a related problem would be, well, I mean, this would be now very simple. What if X was the same number of people than Y? So for every person in department X, I would also have another person in department Y. So then you would have 25,000 plus 35,000 divided by 2, just the average between 2 people, basically, which would give you 30,000. But you are given the information that we have twice as many in X as in Y, or more, even more. So another case would be that X is exactly 2 times Y. So now you could imagine a company with 3 people, 2 which are in the department X and 1 which is in the department Y. So you would have 2 times 25,000 plus 35,000. But now your company had 3 employees. And of course, you could scale this up. You could say, well, there are 6 people or 12 people. This ratio doesn't change anymore. But what you would get now is 85,000 divided by 3. And that's a number that I would personally put into the calculator now. Like this one, I would not do myself, which happens to be, which I calculated before, 28,333. And now another important strategy here. The GRE, it's called quantitative reasoning. So what's the reasoning now? You have just assumed there are twice as many people in X than in Y. But actually, we know they are more than twice. And so if you look again at the averages, you have 25,000 for the X people and 35,000 for the Y. So the more people in X I have, the more I will push it towards the 25,000. If you would have 1 million people in X and just one in Y, the one in Y would almost not matter. So you see that this 28,300 is kind of an upper bound, and the real number must be below. So you can already exclude, if you go to your answers, all the ones here going down, they're all higher than 28,300. And in the GRE now, I would be confident enough to just select A and B, because they're never asking you to get the exact ratio. Is it 2.1? Is it 2.2? They're not going into this. What they want you to understand is that you can simplify the question to this. Is it 2 times more? And then in what direction do you have to go? So you have to push it more towards the 25,000 than to a higher direction. So the right answers here are 26,000 and 28,000. All right, so then, and I think we will be done in about 3 minutes. So thanks Chukwemeka and Esther for waiting. I apologize for going a bit longer. Another important strategy is to understand whether a conclusion follows from the information that we provided. So again, this is a quantitative comparison where we have been given the information that W is greater than 1. And so now you can again, as we've done before, kind of try to simplify the expression. So you want to know, is 7W minus 4, which is quantity A, is that larger or smaller than 2W plus 5? So you could rewrite this where you take the W's on one side. So let's take them on the left side. We do minus 2W. And we take the 4 on the other side. So we're left with 9. That's still a bit too complicated. So we want to have divided by 5. So is W smaller or larger than 9 over 5, which is 1.8? And that's the type of calculation I would not do in the calculator. So you know what is 1/5? That is 0.2. And so then it's relatively easy to see that 9 over 5 is 5 over 5 plus 4 over 5, and 4 over 5 is 0.8. So these types of calculations I would not do in the calculator. But now, is W greater or smaller than 1.8? Do we know? We only know that W is greater than 1. So what could W be? W could be 4. But W could also be 1.5. So if W was 4, then W is greater than 1.8. If W was 1.5, then W is smaller than 1.8. So now we found a case where it could be both. So we don't know, is A or B greater? And since we found 2 cases, we can confidently say the relationship cannot be determined from the given information. And now the final strategy is very related, but so that we also have a data interpretation question. It's again kind of, what additional information would I need to solve the problem? And is that information available or not? So what we're shown here is a table with the annual percent change in dollar amount of sales at 5 retail stores from 2006 to 2008. But what's important is it is about the percentage change. And that will be important as we go to the answers. Then we see we have a few stores. We have the percentage change from 2006 to 2007, and we have the change from 07 to 08. Okay, that's kind of all we want to look at first. We don't want to look at all the specific numbers here. That we will do after we read the actual question and what we're supposed to answer. So what this prompt is asking is, based on the information given, which of the following statements must be true? Indicate all such statements. So there are a few things to unpack. First, based on the information given. In none of the data interpretation questions are you supposed to use other facts you know about life or the economy or something else. You always have to restrain yourself to the information given in those little charts. And then you want to know which ones are which one must be true. So without additional information, can I say for 100% sure is it true or not? Indicate all such statements. So there can be more than one correct answer here. Doesn't need to be more. The GRE is trying to trick you in many, many places. Okay, let's look at the first answer choice, which is for 2008, the dollar amount of sales at store R was greater than that at each of the other 4 stores. Okay, so we want to know something about 2008 dollar amount of the store R and then compare it to the other 4 stores. Now we can go back to our table and recall that all we have is percentage changes. We know that in store R, it increased 5% from 06 to 07, and then it increased 12% from 07 to 2008. But we have no idea from what. Was it $1 million before? Was it $10? Was it maybe even $0? $0 it wasn't, but maybe it was $1. So we don't know the levels. And so we cannot answer this question without knowing the levels. So the strategy is asking you, what additional information would I need? I would need to know what was the sales in 2006, and I don't have that. So I don't know, must it be true? It could be true, but must, we don't know that. Now, question B, the dollar amount of sales at store S. Now, you can already be a bit skeptical, but not necessarily. It's asking you about dollar amounts. Was 22% less than that for 2006. So in 2008, was it 22% less? And this is really the GRE trying to trick you now. So we want to look at store S. So we will look at this store. And from 2006 to 2007, we had a 7% reduction. And then we have a 15% reduction in the year after. So what the GRE wants you to do is do -7 plus -15 equals -22. And think, it's correct, 22% less. But that would be false. So they want to trick you. Because what actually happens here is you have some kind of amount in 2006. Then in the next year, you have a 7% reduction. So you only have 39% left. In the year after, you have a 15% reduction. So you only have, and I should maybe use different symbols here, you only have 85% left. And this is a question, you don't have to type this in the calculator anymore. This is less than if you took the same amount and multiplied it by 0.78, which would be the 22% reduction. Because what you're taking, it's actually probably more. Sorry, it will be more. Because you're taking a 15% reduction of something that is already less than the full amount. So almost always though, like maybe you do want to check this in the calculator later actually, but in almost all cases, when you have something like 22%, it is different to adding up the numbers. So that's an important mistake many people do. They will do this first thing here, whereas what you need to do is the second thing here. And now A and B were not right. One must be right. So you can already say C is correct without looking at it. I would not even, in the GRE, I would not look at it anymore.